Forget shining knights, heroic battles, and glorious castles. The Middle Ages had another side, a world whispered about in taverns, hidden behind thick wooden doors, and officially erased from noble chronicles. Yet it was always there. I'm talking about the medieval brothel, the forbidden pleasure houses of Europe. Imagine walking through the streets of 14th century Paris. By day, you see merchants selling cloth, bakers pulling bread from ovens, and priests walking with solemn faces. But when the sun sets, certain streets transform. Lanterns flicker at doorways, music leaks through shuttered windows, and men slip inside places they pretend not to know. This was the nightlife of medieval Europe, and brothels were at its very center. Now, here's the shocking truth. In many cities, brothels were not hidden at all. They were legal and regulated by local authorities. That's right, the very towns that punished adultery with harsh laws often had official red light districts, where prostitution was tolerated, taxed, and sometimes even encouraged. Paris, London, Cologne, and Florence all had quarters known for their public houses of pleasure. The logic was simple if uncomfortable. Authorities believed it was better for men to go to brothels than to disturb honorable women. A strange kind of moral compromise. Sin was allowed as long as it was contained. In fact, some medieval thinkers argued that brothels were a necessary evil to protect society. Augustine of Hippo once wrote that removing prostitutes would unleash chaos upon the world. Many rulers agreed. And here's a surprising fact. Brothels were not only tolerated, they were sometimes owned by the city itself. In 14th century Toulouse, France, the municipal government operated an official brothel and collected income from it. In London, Southwark's brothels along the Thames were licensed by the Bishop of Winchester. Yes, the church itself indirectly profited from prostitution. Those women were called the Winchester geese, and they had to pay special taxes to work legally. But the reality was not glamorous. Medieval brothels were crowded, dimly lit, and often dangerous. Rooms were small, furniture simple, and hygiene poor. Many were little more than wooden shacks or rented townhouses converted into a maze of chambers. Music, laughter, and cheap wine tried to mask the misery inside. Women worked long hours, often under strict control of a madam or city officials. For many, it wasn't a choice but a last resort to escape hunger or poverty. Society's view was deeply contradictory. On one hand, prostitutes were shunned, denied burial in consecrated ground, and mocked in plays. On the other, they were essential to the social fabric, silently accepted by husbands, priests, and even kings. Chronicles mention noblemen disguising themselves to visit brothels, and scandals erupted when they were caught. The hypocrisy was everywhere. Life around these places could be lively, almost carnival-like. Street vendors gathered near brothels to sell food, drinks, and trinkets. Gambling and music accompanied the nights. Taverns often stood next door, feeding both the body and the sin. A whole microeconomy grew around pleasure districts. Yet, despite their importance, brothels were always precarious. A new ruler, a sudden plague, or rising pressure from moral reformers could shut them down overnight. And still, as soon as one closed, another opened elsewhere. Demand never disappeared. This first glimpse shows us the raw paradox of medieval society. Brothels were simultaneously condemned and protected, despised and needed, hidden and regulated. They stood at the heart of medieval cities, shaping daily life in ways most history books leave out. And this is just the beginning. In the next part, we'll step through those wooden doors and explore how brothels actually worked. The rules, the prices, the managers, and the strange laws that turned sin into business. Step inside the forbidden doors of a medieval brothel, and you'll quickly realize this was not the fantasy many imagine. These places were not glamorous dens of luxury, but carefully managed businesses, sometimes even run by city authorities. The shocking part? They followed rules, regulations, and taxes just like any other trade. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, brothels often operated in designated red light districts. Southwark in London, on the southern bank of the Thames, was the most infamous. The church technically condemned prostitution, Yet the brothels there were licensed by none other than the Bishop of Winchester. Women working under his jurisdiction became known as the Winchester geese. They had to pay fees for the right to work, essentially turning sin into revenue. Inside, life followed strict routines. Brothels had opening hours, usually in the evenings, and often closed during church festivals or holy days. Women paid rent for their rooms, and part of their earnings went to the brothel keeper or madam. Prices could vary depending on the city, the reputation of the house, and the looks of the women. In some places, records survive showing a menu of services with fixed rates, like any other business. One extraordinary case comes from 14th century Toulouse, where the entire brothel was owned by the municipal government. The city council appointed a manager, kept records, and collected profits directly. In return, the brothel had to operate under strict guidelines. Women were inspected for health, fights were punished, and customers were not allowed to harass respectable women outside the district. It was a bizarre partnership between vice and bureaucracy. But what was it like inside? Forget velvet curtains. Most medieval brothels were modest, sometimes even grim. Small wooden rooms with straw beds, cheap candles, and little privacy. Furniture was basic, walls were thin, and hygiene was nearly non-existent. In wealthier cities, there were larger establishments with music, dancing, and wine to attract noble clients. But even those were far from the luxurious images we see in modern fiction. Clients came from every class. Soldiers returning from campaigns, merchants after long journeys, students in university towns like Paris or Bologna, and yes, even nobles who disguised themselves to avoid scandal. These men often left quickly, not wanting to be seen. The irony? Everyone knew who visited, but society played along with the silence. The women themselves lived under constant supervision. Many brothels had rules for appearance. Women had to wear distinctive clothing, often striped hoods or bright dresses, so they could not be mistaken for respectable wives. In some German towns, prostitutes were forced to wear bells on their belts, making them recognizable in public. It was both a humiliation and a safety measure, ensuring they stayed within the system. The economics were brutal. Women kept only a fraction of what they earned, with the rest going to the house. They had to pay for food, clothing, and sometimes even for candles or bedding. Some managed to save money and leave, but many were trapped by poverty, debt, or coercion. Illness was common, especially venereal diseases, which spread quickly in such conditions. City doctors occasionally inspected women, but without real medical knowledge, little could be done. Despite the hardships, brothels were a lively part of the city's nightlife. Taverns stood nearby, selling cheap wine and ale. Musicians played lutes and drums, drawing in clients with noise and festivity. Gambling often went hand in hand with prostitution, creating a carnival-like atmosphere. For better or worse, these quarters were alive when the rest of the city slept. The contradiction remained at the heart of it all. Brothels were despised in sermons and mocked in plays, yet regulated and taxed like bakeries or blacksmiths. The same authorities who condemned them in public speeches relied on them in practice. It was hypocrisy woven into the very fabric of medieval life. And this raises a deeper question. Who were the women inside these walls? Were they truly there by choice, or were they victims of circumstance? In the next part, we'll step into their lives and uncover the harsh reality of women in medieval brothels, their struggles, survival, and the stigma that followed them to the grave. If the brothel looked like a place of business from the outside, inside it was the women who paid the highest price. Their stories reveal the dark reality of medieval prostitution, a world of poverty, coercion, and stigma that rarely offered escape. Who were these women? Contrary to the common myth, most were not fallen ladies of luxury, but women at the very edge of survival. Many were widows left with no income, daughters from poor families, or unmarried women cast out of their homes. Some were orphans, others were sold into the trade by desperate relatives. In cities like Paris or London, officials even forced idle women, meaning those without work, into brothels, believing it was better for them to serve in vice than beg on the streets. Life inside was harsh. Women rented their own rooms or shared cramped spaces, often with straw mattresses and little privacy. They had to pay fees to the madam or city authorities, which meant most of their earnings disappeared immediately. Records from Southwark show that prostitutes had to pay for everything: food, clothes, bedding, even candles for their rooms. Debt was a constant trap, keeping women tied to the brothel for years. Health was another constant threat. With little understanding of medicine, venereal diseases spread quickly. In some German cities, authorities mandated health inspections, but these were crude at best. Treatments often involved mercury or herbal brews, which were dangerous and ineffective. For many women, illness meant being thrown out, left to die in poverty. Life expectancy for prostitutes was brutally short compared to other women of their time. And then there was the stigma. Prostitutes were branded as outsiders. Many cities forced them to wear distinctive clothing: striped hoods, bright dresses, or even bells attached to their belts, so that everyone could recognize them. They were forbidden from marrying respectable men, and when they died, many were denied burial in consecrated ground. In Cologne, prostitutes had to be buried outside the city walls in unmarked graves. Even in death, they remained excluded from society. Yet despite the shame and hardship, brothels were paradoxical spaces. They offered women a certain degree of independence unavailable elsewhere. Some women earned enough to buy freedom, open taverns, or even become brothel madams themselves. Others used their position to gain influence with wealthy clients: soldiers, merchants, even nobles. In rare cases, prostitutes became mistresses to powerful men, rising in status far above their beginnings. But these were exceptions. For most, daily life was controlled, exhausting, and dangerous. Brothel keepers enforced strict rules, often beating women who disobeyed. Authorities demanded that prostitutes remain in their districts and forbade them from wandering into respectable areas. If caught, they faced fines or prison. The very system that tolerated them also kept them trapped. And yet, society relied on them. Men visited these women in secret, then returned to their families, pretending nothing happened. Priests condemned them in sermons, yet sometimes slipped into brothels themselves. It was the ultimate double standard. Women carried the shame, while men walked away untouched. The contradictions could be cruel. In some places, prostitutes were forced to participate in public rituals of humiliation. One record from Augsburg describes women paraded through the streets wearing crowns of straw, mocked by crowds. At the same time, these same women were essential to the city's economy, paying taxes that funded roads, bridges, and even churches. And through it all, there was the human side, moments of resilience, survival, and even solidarity. Some women formed close bonds, helping each other through sickness and poverty. Others resisted the rules in small ways, sneaking food to one another or hiding coins from brothel keepers. Their stories are hard to recover, because official records rarely mention their names, but fragments survive. They remind us that behind the statistics and laws were real people, living difficult lives in a world stacked against them. So when we think of medieval brothels, we shouldn't picture glamour or mystery. We should see the women who endured them, stigmatized by society, exploited by authorities, yet still fighting in their own ways to survive. And as we move forward, the story takes another turn. What role did the church play in this paradox? How could a society so deeply religious tolerate such open sin? In the next part, we'll uncover the tense, often hypocritical relationship between the church and the brothels of medieval Europe. How could the most religious civilization in Europe's history openly tolerate places of sin? How could cities that rang church bells every hour also light lanterns in brothel streets every night? The answer lies in one of the strangest contradictions of the Middle Ages: the uneasy alliance between the church and prostitution. On paper, the church condemned sex outside of marriage as one of the gravest sins. Priests preached fiery sermons against lust, calling prostitutes the daughters of Eve, who led men into damnation. Religious texts spoke of them as corrupters of the soul, and canon law officially forbade their trade. Yet, in practice, the church often looked the other way, and in some cases even profited from the very vice it condemned. One of the clearest examples comes from Southwark in London. The brothels there, just across the Thames, were legally licensed by the Bishop of Winchester. That's right. The women who worked there paid rent to the church itself. They were known as the Winchester geese. In return, the brothels were protected from harassment by authorities. But here's the bitter irony. When these women died, the same church that took their money refused to bury them in consecrated ground. They were laid to rest in unconsecrated cemeteries, often with no markers. Profit was welcome, salvation was not. Elsewhere in Europe, bishops and abbots sometimes tolerated brothels because they believed it was a lesser evil. The idea was that it was better for men to visit prostitutes than to seduce married women or, worse in their eyes, commit unnatural acts. By channeling desire into regulated spaces, the church and city authorities thought they were protecting society. It was a moral compromise wrapped in hypocrisy. But the contradictions went deeper. Clergy themselves were frequently caught in brothels. Records from Paris and Florence describe scandals where priests were discovered among clients. Some monasteries became notorious for secret tunnels leading to nearby pleasure houses. Sermons thundered about purity, while reality whispered something else entirely. And when scandals grew too public, the church cracked down. Not on the men, but on the women. Prostitutes were paraded through towns in humiliating processions, forced to wear crowns of straw or walk barefoot in the cold as penance. In Cologne, brothel women were sometimes whipped before being allowed to return to their work. The church's message was clear. Sin was tolerable as long as women carried all the blame. Brothels also became part of the church's broader debates about morality and reform. Preachers like Bernardino of Siena in the 15th century demanded the destruction of pleasure houses, calling them dens of the devil. In some towns, this pressure led to closures, but usually only temporarily. As soon as reformers moved on, brothels reopened. The demand was too strong, and the revenue too tempting for permanent change. This uneasy relationship shaped medieval life in unexpected ways. By tolerating prostitution, the church and cities created an official underclass of women who lived outside respectability but inside the system. They were both despised and protected, shamed and used. It was a contradiction that mirrored the entire Middle Ages, a society deeply religious yet painfully human. And this is why the story of medieval brothels is more than just gossip from the past. It reveals how power, morality, and survival collided in daily life. The same church that built cathedrals also turned a blind eye to brothel streets. The same priests who warned against lust sometimes slipped into the shadows themselves. But the story doesn't end here. If the church's role shows us hypocrisy, the scandals involving kings, nobles, and entire cities reveal how far these contradictions could go. In the next part, we'll dive into the most infamous cases, the great brothels of Paris, London, and Nuremberg, and the scandals that shocked even medieval society. Every medieval city had its secrets, but some brothels were so infamous that they became part of the city's identity. Their scandals spilled out into chronicles, court records, and even plays, giving us rare glimpses into the forbidden nightlife of the Middle Ages. One of the largest and best documented brothel districts was in Paris, known as the Rue Chaude, the hot streets. These were not hidden back alleys, but entire neighborhoods where brothels lined the roads, marked by red lanterns or painted signs. Clients included merchants, soldiers, and sometimes even university students from the Sorbonne. City officials tried to regulate these districts, but scandals often erupted. In the 14th century, for example, Paris records describe fights breaking out between drunken nobles and brothels, leaving authorities scrambling to contain the mess. London's Southwark district was equally notorious. As we saw earlier, these brothels were licensed by the Bishop of Winchester, which gave them an odd kind of legitimacy. But they also produced scandal after scandal. In 1436, officials raided a brothel only to find not just prostitutes and clients, but also married men, clergy, and even minor officials from the king's court. The incident caused an uproar, yet the brothels reopened within days. Money and demand were stronger than shame. Meanwhile, Nuremberg in Germany offers one of the strangest examples. In the 15th century, the city operated a Frauenhaus, literally a women's house, that was owned and managed by the city council itself. Men paid a fixed fee to the city, which was then used to maintain the brothel and even fund other civic projects. This official brothel became so central that its rules were publicly posted. Men could only visit at certain hours, violence was forbidden, and women were required to undergo inspections. Yet even with such bureaucracy, scandals were common. One story tells of a high-ranking merchant's son caught brawling with guards after refusing to pay his fee. Scandal wasn't limited to cities. Royal courts also had their share of gossip. Chronicles from the French court in the late Middle Ages describe nobles disguising themselves in plain clothes to sneak into brothels, only to be recognized by their mannerisms or jewelry. When caught, it caused outrage, not because they visited prostitutes, but because they failed to maintain the dignity expected of the nobility. In some cases, kings themselves were rumored to keep mistresses taken from brothels, a fact whispered among courtiers but rarely written down. Even universities were tied to these scandals. In Oxford and Bologna, students were infamous for frequenting local brothels, often causing so much trouble that city authorities had to intervene. In one case from 13th century Oxford, students fought with townsfolk near a brothel, leading to riots that left several people dead. Brothels, in other words, were not just places of pleasure, they were powder kegs for conflict. But perhaps the most shocking scandals came during times of plague. In several cities, authorities closed brothels to slow the spread of disease, yet clandestine houses kept operating. Women were accused of being spreaders of illness, and in some cases, entire brothel districts were burned down in fear. Yet as soon as the crisis passed, the same cities rebuilt and reopened the houses, showing how deeply ingrained they were in urban life. What all these examples reveal is the strange duality of brothels in the Middle Ages. They were both regulated and chaotic, tolerated and scandalous, public yet secretive. They involved not just the poor and desperate, but also the powerful and elite. And every scandal peeled back the mask of respectability, showing the very human desires that shaped medieval society. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the grand experiment of the medieval brothel began to collapse. For centuries, these places had been tolerated, taxed, and even managed by governments and bishops. But change was coming, and it would arrive with disease, reform, and a new sense of morality that no amount of hypocrisy could contain. The first and perhaps greatest blow came in the late 15th century with the spread of syphilis. This terrifying new disease swept through Europe with devastating speed. Soldiers returning from campaigns brought it into cities, and brothels became epicenters of infection. Chroniclers described sores, fevers, and deaths that horrified even hardened physicians. Authorities panicked. In Paris, London, and Florence, brothels were suddenly declared public health hazards. Some were closed outright, others were ordered to expel sick women, who were left to wander the streets in misery. The very places once seen as necessary evils now became symbols of fear. At the same time, religious reform movements gained strength. Preachers thundered against lust, demanding that cities cleanse themselves of sin. In Germany, reformers rallied crowds to shut down pleasure districts. In Italy, fiery voices like Savonarola in Florence denounced brothels alongside gambling and vanity. His bonfires of the vanities symbolized a wider rejection of urban vice. The church, once willing to tolerate prostitution, increasingly sided with reformers. Councils passed stricter laws, bishops declared crackdowns, and brothels found themselves without protection. But it wasn't just religion or disease. The very structure of European society was shifting. Cities became more tightly regulated, rulers more concerned with order and control. Respectability and family reputation grew more important, especially among rising merchant classes. To be associated with a brothel now carried more risk than reward. Scandals that once blew over began to destroy reputations permanently. And yet, brothels did not vanish overnight. In many towns, they simply moved underground. Illegal houses of prostitution continued in alleys and taverns, hidden behind false doors and secret rooms. Authorities cracked down harder, but demand never disappeared. Instead, the trade became more dangerous for the women involved. No longer protected by regulation, they were more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The hypocrisy of society remained. Men still visited, but now in even greater secrecy, while women still carried all the blame. By the 16th century, the grand municipal brothels like Nuremberg's Frauenhaus were closing. Toulouse no longer ran its official brothel. Even Southwark in London, once protected by the Bishop of Winchester, faced increasing pressure until the district faded from its infamous glory. Europe's pleasure houses, once loud and public, fell silent one by one. What were the consequences of this decline? On the surface, cities claimed victory for morality and health. Preachers celebrated. Reformers wrote triumphantly of cleansed towns. But the truth was more complicated. The women who once lived under at least some degree of protection in regulated brothels were now forced into more dangerous conditions. Prostitution didn't end. It only became less visible, harder, and often more brutal. The history of medieval brothels reminds us of the contradictions at the heart of the Middle Ages. A deeply religious society that tolerated vice. A church that condemned lust yet profited from it. Governments that outlawed sin while taxing it to build bridges and cathedrals. And in the end, when reform and disease swept the system away, the women who bore the weight of it all remained just as vulnerable. So when we imagine medieval Europe, we should not only picture knights on horseback and kings in shining halls. We should also remember the women in dimly lit rooms, the districts that never made it into official chronicles, and the scandals whispered in taverns long after the church bells rang. Their story is not one of glory, but of survival, caught between sin and necessity, tolerance and rejection, power and hypocrisy. And that is the true legacy of the medieval brothel. Not just a place of forbidden pleasure, but a mirror reflecting the darkest contradictions of its time.